This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
And we're back for more punishment. It's always time for more punishment whenever we're talking about modern wrestling, right? Just sat here a few days ago to record the remainder of the Friday show. Going through all the flim-flam and discussion over what's to come on the Friday podcast for the future. Now that we're taking a voluntary AEW hiatus for the time being. Now I'm basically here to reiterate the same talking points again. Although I'm actually going to look forward to some of the changes we'll be making on the channel because, boy, are they long overdue. And just in case you're checking out the show for the first time and you have no idea what I'm about to talk about, first of all, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the show, comment. You are currently tuned into the Monday edition of the FSWR podcast, a Monday show that used to be dedicated to weekly recaps of SmackDown, Collision, Retro Raw, and weekend pay-per-view events. Now has been reduced to, well, basically all of that, minus Collision, with one addition that I will mention very shortly. But it is time for a change. Long gone are the days where I've been bitten by the AEW bug. It is a bug, all right. Just not the kind of bug you want crawling around in your intestines. With that said, I'm talking about ways that I can modify the channel and give people an incentive to want to come back every week. Since this channel's mostly turned into a retro review channel to some degree. You all know I'm a big proponent of reminiscing about the good old days of pro wrestling. Now I was thinking to myself, what would be a suitable replacement for a third segment on the Monday show? And we talked about how my goal is to make the Monday podcast more WWF or WWE driven. We've already got the Retro Raws we're talking about, and we're about a year delved into that rabbit hole. Ain't no turning back now. But I basically had a few options to work with. And again, this is kind of the benefit of having the Peacock subscription and getting access to all that tape library. God, there's so much stuff. Like, if you really sat down to analyze it, it's just an endless supply of material. It'll keep you busy for an entire lifetime. And then some. I don't know how people have the time to sit down and watch all that stuff, man. I mean, there's classic shows, territorial footage, documentaries, interviews. It's so much stuff. I mean, it's probably a little bit of a downside to think about it. You have all that content at your disposal. Where do you even start? And there was a part of me that thought, well, since you're already doing the Retro Raws, you could hypothetically dive into Retro SmackDown to try and be somewhat consistent. And I did think about it. But here's the issue I ran into. Since SmackDown wasn't an idea that the WWF came up with until, was it August of 99? I think it was August. The point is, if we were trying to keep things relatively consistent with what we're currently doing with Retro Raw, man, we're still about 5 years removed from SmackDown even becoming a concept. So I don't think a retro SmackDown review series would make a whole lot of sense in the overall scope of at least what we're doing on the channel right now. You know, with Retro Raw talking from 1994. It doesn't mean that we couldn't add Retro SmackDown to the discussion panel in a few years. But for right now, I wouldn't consider that something that I would want to put at the top of the pecking order. But then I thought, okay, what about WWF Superstars or Primetime Wrestling or even Superstars of Wrestling from the mid-'80s? It'd be a different period that we're talking about, but it would fit the theme of the classic WWF content. So I stewed on that idea for a little bit. And then a thought hit me. You know, we're already talking about so much wrestling from the 80s, a lot of wrestling from the 90s. It's not necessarily classic in the traditional sense of how we might view the wrestling tape library. But since it was a popular thing at one point, and I did sort of watch that era of the black and gold brand from start to finish, relatively speaking, I thought, what the heck? How about a classic NXT review series? And here's my thought process with that. Or thought processes, as Dusty might say. Whatever the plural of process is. Is it processes? Too many S's, pal. But, well, here's the thing. It's WWE content, so it fits the theme of what we're talking about with the Monday show. And when you compare it to things we're currently talking about with Retro Raw and modern SmackDown, it kind of fits into its own separate category of retro discussion. It'd be me going through a particular era of the NXT library, kind of like how we're doing with everything else on the network. But it's a more up-to-date classic review series, if you will. And I know a lot of modern fans have a sweet tooth when it comes to the black and gold era of NXT. A lot of the guys we saw go through that system either became big stars in WWE by their own right, or in the case of those that came in during the hot streak of the indie circuit, a lot of those names are current guys that we see in companies like AEW. And I guess you could say I've had a fairly hot and cold relationship when it comes to NXT, the developmental brand. Obviously, if I were to do a retro review series of NXT, I would not want to start with the original concept of what NXT was back in the day. If anybody can even remember that. The very early incarnations of NXT. Back when it was essentially a watered-down version of Tough Enough. You remember all the game show challenges and the horrible skits everybody did? Now, granted, there is sort of a nostalgia factor to go back and watch a few of those episodes. If anything, just to look back and see what poor saps got thrust into that catastrophe of a program. The ones that came out on the better end. Bryan Danielson was part of that, right? Good Lord, how did he survive? He was the only one. And I actually went through to see where the best place would be to start for an NXT Classic review series. You know, because even when we're looking back at the old WWE developmental system, before NXT even became its own official standalone developmental brand, Florida Championship Wrestling was still their primary location for developmental. They had already split from their working agreement with OVW, but FCW was still a thing until... God, I think it was 2012, right? Then eventually they just ended up rebranding it as NXT. And while those episodes are documented and archived on the network, I think the real golden era of NXT for me really began once they relocated to Full Sail and started doing all their tapings from there. That's sort of where they established their home base. And while everybody knows the whole rebranding of NXT 2.0 basically killed my interest in the product, I do have vaguely fond memories of some of the great stuff during that 2013 to 2018, 2019 period. The Wednesday Night Wars. God, I'm old enough to remember when we were talking about some of that stuff here on the channel. You know, once the lockdown era happened, that's honestly where I kind of lost my initial interest in NXT. I would say it started to wane around that point, and then, you know, by the time they came back and did the whole NXT 2.0 thing, that was pretty much it for me. And there were other key issues that factored into it. It was a tough call for me to make because, I mean, truthfully, I could have gone with anything. But I think the retro NXT series would be a lot of fun for me. Give me a chance to go back and watch to see some familiar faces, some not so familiar faces. You know, look back and see what kinds of storylines and angles they were doing at the time. Seeing how things shifted over time, because that's honestly one of the big revamps that NXT went through during its prime. Seeing the visions of what guys like Hunter had for NXT versus the visions Vince had. Because think about this too. What started as the developmental system for WWE ended up sort of unintentionally turning into a modified, updated indie promotion with better production and professional quality. Seeing how everything slowly expanded once NXT started to become a must-see program every week. We all remember that glory period about 5 or 6 years ago, before AEW was even a concept. What was the most popular wrestling show in the market that everybody was checking out? The one that the internet marks were going out of their way to see. It wasn't Raw. It wasn't SmackDown. It was NXT. And it grew so rapidly in popularity. You know, the WWE started running those annual takeover events that became an overnight success. Well, the first one they ran, I still remember it. NXT Arrival, 2014. Full Sail University. The first ever semi-developmental brand pay-per-view event on the WWE Network. Because remember, that was around the point the network was first launching. God, remember all the shameless $9.99 plugs WWE was promoting? Hunter and Stephanie coming out on Raw every week and telling the fans to dish out their $9.99 for the WWE Network. God, it was so tasteless. But eventually the takeover events became so popular, you know, they started running bigger venues about a year later. They were running the Barclays Center, cross-promoting that with the annual Big Four pay-per-view events for the main roster. They started gaining international traction overseas, started running takeovers in London, Japan, Australia, Canada, you name it. It was a very fascinating period in wrestling during the mid-2010s. You know, during a time when the business in general was really sagging. There wasn't a whole lot of alternative options for hardcore fans in particular, outside the main WWE shows. The internet fans kind of found their niche. And oddly enough, it came at the expense of WWE's developmental system, where the people just decided the main roster product is such horseshit, even WWE's developmental brand is blowing their product out of the water. And arguably for a certain time, maybe it was. It was certainly more must-see than Raw or SmackDown was. Whether or not it was the better product, well, you know, hindsight is 2020. We can certainly dive into that discussion along the way, but I can't argue that for a very slight period of time, maybe like a 2 or 3, 4 year window, yeah, NXT was the modern day the modern day AEW Dynamite for the internet fan base. The ones that wanted an alternative product, a real one, something that could compete with what Raw and SmackDown were doing at the time. Something Impact was never going to be able to withstand because, well, it was Impact. Look who was running the ship. Ring of Honor never gained that kind of traction. The indie circuit, I mean, it was only going to get them so far. You know, a couple years out from the initial Full Sail launch, we were sitting here raving about those classic FTR DIY matches or the FTR American Alpha Tag matches, which I always personally enjoyed more than the DIY matches. It really was a unique product that stood out above everything else currently going on in the market. Yet it was still under the WWE umbrella. But Vince wasn't so hands-on with it. That was sort of Hunter's baby. But think about that for a minute. People hated the main roster product so much. But because companies like TNA and ROH were never able to compete with that, they were complete blimps on the radar. Before WWE got the chance to raid their talent pool and bring over all its top stars, NXT was sort of the go-to stop for hardcores. The passionate, loyal fans that just wanted something to sink their teeth into. So that is why I'm here to say that officially starting next week on the channel, in addition to our Mid-South review series that will be kicking off on the Friday show, next Monday, I will be delving into my classic NXT review series. As I noted, we will not be starting with the garbage challenge show material for the first few seasons. I'm trying not to immediately kill my buzz. No, we're going to start with the weekly TV content. And since the Full Sail era is the one that's most critically acclaimed, I think it would be best to start out the NXT review series with the pre-Full Sail Arena boom period. So we're going to launch everything starting with the September 18th, 2013 episode. So make sure y'all put a paperclip on that one and come back to join me next week for that discussion. I'm looking forward to it. You know, I already read over the synopsis report on the network, and I believe it read something to the extent of an 8-man tag match featuring the current reigning NXT Tag Team Champions, Adrian Neville and Corey Graves. So already I'm going to be asking a lot of questions, such as, did anybody else ever remember the time that Adrian Neville and Corey Graves were the developmental brand's tag team champions? Or moreover, questions like, did anyone else remember the time Corey Graves was actually a pro wrestler, as opposed to the flagship show's color commentator? Was he as bad a professional wrestler as he is a commentator? And who the fuck is Adrian Neville? All questions that you'll need to come back and revisit with me next week. And for the record, yes, I do remember who Adrian Neville was. No, I did not like the name change at the time. But to think, that same guy would wind up spinning his wheels in AEW over a decade later as Pac. Good Lord. That's going to be the fun part. Looking back and going, hey, I remember that guy when he was a big deal 10 years ago. Now he's either retired, wrestling for Impact in front of 10 people, getting buried in WWE's mid-card purgatory, or getting buried in AEW's mid-card purgatory. Which one's worse? We should make it a guessing game. Can you guess how many active names that were wrestling in NXT 10 years ago are still either wrestling and or relevant today? The answer is, unless your name was Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, or Jon Moxley, chances are no. But boy, am I looking forward to it. But why don't we go ahead and proceed with today's show, because we do have Retro Raw and SmackDown to talk about here. And we're back in the saddle. Had a couple weeks off from Retro Raw. And now I feel like I missed an entire year's worth of content. What the hell was happening on this show prior to SummerSlam? Help a brother out. I can't remember for the life of me. Well, I guess for starters, we can begin here. This is the first Raw post SummerSlam 1994. It is still Raw. It is a mostly nothing happening 45-minute program with a couple squashes, some wacky segments thrown in, and that's about all we're looking at. I can't even remember what building they were at for this thing. Somewhere in Lowell, Massachusetts. I mean, at this point, we are still a ways out from Survivor Series in November, so we were pretty much dealing with a fill-in show. I guess you could argue the big attraction for this week was the fans getting to see The Undertaker back in action for the first time in like 9 months. And obviously, given the circumstances of the whole DiBiase storyline and the lead up to the pay-per-view, it is important to note, this was the real Undertaker, not the Underfaker. No, they put that story behind them as quickly as possible. And it probably would be in our best interest to just gloss over that feud entirely, because it was quite ass. But how's this for a return match? 9 months. Taker has not had a match on Monday Night Raw in 9 months. His first official match back since January. And who is his opponent? Kwang. Of all people on the fucking roster. Well, I guess they had to feed him somebody lower on the totem pole. I'll tell you the main thing that stood out to me watching this. I didn't realize how fucking tiny Savio Vega was until I saw him standing there with The Undertaker. It had to be at least an entire foot's height difference. Of course, there's every Taker squash you've ever seen. I'm biased because he's my all-time favorite wrestler. You all know that. But, yeah, he just kind of did his usual stuff here. The zombie sit-up. No selling almost everything in the book. The bump over the top rope to the floor where he lands on his feet. Old school. Which, at this point, I think Vince was just calling it, "What a maneuver!" Because it really didn't have a name. I did like the finish. If anything, for the wackiness of the execution. As you all know, Kwang was doing the Oriental gimmick here, so they gave him the mist spot. At one point in the match, he randomly just shot out red mist, which really didn't lead to anything. But right toward the finish here, as Harvey Whippleman was running a distraction on the apron, Kwang spat out green mist into Taker's eyes, and well, not only did Taker no-sell it, but then he shot the mist back and spat it directly in Kwang's face, which somehow did have an effect on him. So Taker was apparently impervious to whatever this green food coloring was. And then Taker hit a choke slam on him like 3 seconds later and won. The only thing I really gathered out of it was, in order to execute that, Taker legitimately would have had to catch the mist in his mouth, which was previously in Savio's mouth. Good thing COVID wasn't a thing back in the day. I don't even want to know what kind of health hazard violations went into that spot. Gross. But, just a way for them to reestablish Taker as an active wrestler again. If you caught Vince on commentary, he was passingly mentioning Yokozuna in the casket match from the Rumble back in January. The inconclusive nature of that rivalry. If you're aware of where this all leads in the lead up to Survivor Series, well, they were sort of planting the seeds here. And then coming back from break, they showed a quick highlight reel of the Owen-Brett cage match from SummerSlam, which was their direct lead into Jim Neidhart versus Tim McNeely. And, watching this match in real time, it was kind of an eye-opener in getting me to realize just how truly special Owen Hart was. You remove Owen from the picture, this had to have been the most boring Raw segment in history. It's literally Neidhart pounding on a generic-looking job guy for like 3 minutes. It's not even like McNeely was a job guy worth making fun of. Like, he didn't have a rotten body or a goofy-looking haircut. Just kind of your average, everyday enhancement dude from the mid-90s. He had the traditional wrestling singlet, the moderately long, stringy hair, no body definition, no tan. But, like, I don't know. He didn't really stand out. The Anvil won with a camel clutch. And then while he held the submission after the bell, Owen slapped the signature sunglasses on him so he could pull them back and then catapult them into his face over and over again. That was at least funny. But, I think I mentioned it during my SummerSlam recap. It is still weird to think that the Owen-Brett feud continued well into the beginning of 1995, but how pretty much everything that happened after the cage match was totally forgettable. The feud just sort of fizzled out by the end of the year. It's so weird. I vaguely remember them doing a third match at some point. I can't remember where it happened. Probably on Raw. But to think, Owen's out there bad-mouthing Brett. So based on that logic alone, it would seem the feud is going to continue now. I mean, why else would he still be trash-talking his brother? Despite the fact that Brett won the cage match clean. But it's just a shame that the feud basically peaked at SummerSlam and then everything else that happened afterwards got lost in the shuffle. Speaking of feuds that got lost in the shuffle, I wish that were the case when it came to the Jerry Lawler versus Doink and Dink feud. Sadly, I remember this feud for just being outright terrible and a total waste of Lawler's time. To think, though, the Doink-Lawler feud began because Lawler popped Dink's balloons on television. No, that is not a metaphor. That was a real thing that happened. On Superstars, Lawler pulled a rib on Dink by popping his blow-up balloons and making him sad. And Doink took issue with this, as most clowns are prone to do whenever someone fucks with their balloons. So as a matter of seeking revenge, they held a King's Court segment with Doink, Dink, and the King, where they were basically out there making clown jokes for about 5 minutes. Or in the case of Lawler, it was him making clown jokes and midget jokes. But the idea here is that Lawler was supposed to apologize for bullying Dink. And just to show that there were no hard feelings, Doink had the stage crew bring out a giant gift for Lawler. It is an oddly ginormous box with clown packaging, which is probably the only bit of unintentional comedy here. And of course, Lawler thinks the whole thing's going to be some kind of Jack-in-the-Box rib, where somebody pops out and sprays him with water or something, so he's not taking the bait. He has Doink open the package, and it turns out that the gift is a gimmicked trash can. Oh, because did I mention, in addition to them wasting Lawler on WWF television in 1994 doing feuds with clowns, they also had him feuding with Duke the Dumpster Droese in a feud that is still apparently going on. In what ended up becoming the single greatest rib on Lawler's career, the infamous garbage can incident. But Doink laughs at Lawler because he says that next week, Duke is going to take the trash out of the WWF. Get it? In reference to Lawler. And of course, the slapstick gag here is Lawler trying to punt the garbage can into the front row. But of course, there are two 25-pound weights inside the bottom of the can. So when Lawler goes to kick it, he ends up selling his foot. Oh. Hang on, I'm sorry. Let me get that sound drop queued up. Oops, wrong button. Yeah, this sucked. It really did. As did pretty much everything involving the Doink Lawler feud, which unfortunately does not end anytime soon, and in fact becomes a staple of the Survivor Series pay-per-view in about 2 months. So if you weren't sick of it by now, boy were you in for a doozy. What more do you say about it? This was Vince's definition of comedy in the mid-90s. What was funny to him was death television to any sane, functioning human being. But why don't we get off that subject and talk about Shawn Michaels and Diesel versus Tony DeVito and Paul Van Dale. More importantly, let's talk about Nash's hair. We have now moved past the mullet stage, and now he's sort of in the awkward long hair stage where you can tell he's trying to grow it out, but it's only about at neck length. So he is now at the point where he can add his fifth move of doom, that being the infamous hair flip. All the while, Shawn is still rocking that mullet to a T. The back of his hair is now basically down to his mid-back. The top of it is spiked straight up in the air. It is, You know, if you really think about it for a minute, the 90s were not that long ago. It is amazing that hairstyle was actually a thing back in the day. I mean, my hair's long, but I never would have thought twice about doing the mullet look. I told my stylist, I'll do layers, but I'm not doing the mullet. Fuck that. How in the world people walked around like that back in the day and didn't get laughed at? I will never know. Anyway, Diesel ended up giving DeVito the jackknife during the split screen, and then Shawn gave him a big splash off Diesel's shoulders for the 3, which did look moderately impressive on camera, I have to admit. It was kind of interesting seeing both guys work cohesively again. Like, none of the stuff at SummerSlam just happened. After Shawn literally just cost Diesel the IC title. After Diesel raked Shawn over the coals and they started the tease of the split. Here they are a week later. Totally fine. Right on the same page again. I mean, I know the show was taped, but just totally glossing over it. They also didn't have the tag belts with them, despite them already being the champions by this point. So I have to presume this was taped before SummerSlam, which was just kind of strange. You think they would have thought that one through a bit more. My God, dude. You just listen to Vince on commentary here, practically frothing at the mouth at anything Kevin Nash did. Like, Shawn's out there doing the bulk of the work. Vince doesn't give a fuck. But damn it all, if Nash stepped over the top rope into the ring, it was the greatest thing Vince ever called. Nash gave one of the job guys a boot here. You've never heard a commentator so excited to call a move. I legitimately think Vince popped wood. When Kevin Nash hit this job guy with a big boot, Vince creamed himself. You think he already had his mind made up on who his next big star was going to be? Big star. In air quotes. But it is a very interesting period we're about to enter. The Diesel push era of WWF, circa 1995. Hold on to your butts. We're only in the beginning stages of that hellhole. So then we had... What did we have next? Oh, I remember. There was a brief video pre-tape they showed with Adam Bomb answering an open challenge to Bam Bam Bigelow, which somehow was supposed to be a transition into Adam Bomb versus Dwayne Gill. I didn't even put two and two together that Bomb was supposed to be a babyface. It's crazy to think. Of all gimmicks the WWF randomly decided to drop because they weren't getting over, Adam Bomb lasted for over a year. Good grief. Of course, who am I kidding? Fucking Sparky Plug lasted, what, 4? Duke the Dumpster? How long was that gimmick around for? 3-4 years, too? Maybe I shouldn't be surprised that Adam Bomb lasted as long as it did. How long was Crush a thing? Through all the various incarnations of Crush. Anyway. Bomb won with a pump handle slam in about 3 minutes. Totally pointless match. Crowd didn't care. I did like the Macho Man referring to a drop-down spot here as a, quote, over and under, duck under. Which totally dumbfounded Vince. That's almost as good as Bischoff calling karate kicks on Nitro a few years later. The back leg front round kick. That was my personal favorite. So, well, how's this for a main event? We talked about all the wackiness on this program from a booking standpoint. So I guess it's only fitting that our TV main event this week, a tag match featuring the Bushwhackers. The epitome of wacky in every way imaginable. Did I hear Vince on commentary infer that Luke and Butch were making their way to the Macy's Day Parade to, quote, lick Barney the dinosaur? I hope to God the authorities were called. You know it's bad when even the Bushwhackers are too wacky for the Macho Man. Even he was stupefied by the visual of them licking the fans. And each other. I don't even remember who their opponents were. That's how inconsequential it was. The one dude in the hideous Steiner knockoff apparel was exceptionally indie looking. They do a handful of comedy spots for a while, including a deal where Butch threw the Steiner-looking job guy on top of the other so he could look like he was pinning his own partner. And Luke was counting the visual pin while Hebner was berating him. This resulted in Luke licking Hebner in the side of the neck. The official low point for Earl Hebner's entire wrestling career. Abe Knuckleball Schwartz was still protesting in the crowd. Still completely having nothing to do with the ring action. He's just there. It's just Lombardi doing more bad WWF comedy. And I don't know what the hell happened at the end. The Bushwhackers went over with their goofy battering ram finish. And when they came back to plug the card for next week, we saw Luke and Butch out in the crowd licking and molesting the fans. This is where I wrote down, only the Bushwhackers could get away with licking people's heads on camera and not get put on the registry. God rest Butch. I mean, I like the Sheep Herders during their run in the early to mid-'80s. God, the WWF version of them was just... Well, what was the WWF version? You turn them into wacky comedy figures and make them a lovable babyface team. Instead of running with what got them over initially. The out-of-control, lunatic, grungy ring style. Now, while the actual team went through a lot of incarnations in terms of personnel, whether we're talking about Jonathan Boyd coming in and replacing Butch for a period in the States, or eventually Rip Morgan coming in later on. God, the WWF version of them was such shit. So bad. And to think, they were the same fucking gimmick for what? 5-6 years? When did the Bushwhackers first come in? Was it 89? And they were sort of in and out during their WWF run. We are in 1994. And they're still doing the same gimmick. And I don't think they end up leaving the company until like sometime in 95, 96. So yeah. 6-7 years of this bullshit. Them going out there and doing their goofy dancing. Having cartoony matches and licking people's heads. Again, I repeat. Vince's form of comedy. This is the kind of stuff he was into. Which is very strange to think about. Vince liking the idea of grown men licking people's faces. Creepy. And that was Raw. Back from a 2-week hiatus. And we're immediately back into the cesspool again. A show filled with mostly dull squashes and underneath guys that epitomize the cartoon era of pro wrestling. It's unfortunate to think, but it doesn't get any better from here as we go into 95. That I can confirm. All right, baby. Who said we couldn't talk about modern wrestling? It's not AEW in terms of bad television. I'm at least comfortable calling this a pro wrestling show. Although sometimes the sports entertainment dynamic reeks of rottenness. But hey, I'll credit them here. At least this company bothers to actually recap their pay-per-views fully. I already had long since put that entire Payback special behind me. There were like 1 or 2 things I actually recalled happening on that show. In the grand scheme of everything, what would you say the general consensus was? It was a very forgettable show? Yeah, I would say that. Wasn't great. Wasn't terrible. Just very mid. Plain. Average. But, you know, for a buffer pay-per-view in between the big 4 shows, it was serviceable. And now that we're moving on, I believe their next Peacock special is it Fastlane? I think I read that somewhere. Yeah, I mean, technically Survivor Series isn't until November. Figuring they were going to have at least one more filler show beforehand. Not counting NXT. But, now we got SmackDown here to talk about, and I really didn't do a great job mentally pre-planning for this one. If it wasn't already enough of a headache in the first 5 minutes, hearing that the opening match was going to be a girls' match, pile that on top of the fact that the first 2 ring introductions for this match, brace yourselves here, Charlotte Flair and Botchzy. And I said, oh, hell fucking nah. In that order. You already had me with Charlotte. Say no more. That was the point of no return for me. But then hearing that she was going to team up with that weird-looking, tattooed, green-haired, tank-riding goth chick, fuck that noise. I'll go into the kitchen to heat up my dinner and come back when this bullshittery is done and over with. First 15 minutes of the show wasted on a Charlotte Shotzi versus Damage Control tag match. Who could possibly care? And then Io and Asuka shouted something at each other in Japanese after the bell. Asuka did a wacky hip thrust. Then she left. And by the time I actually sat down to watch anything live on the program, taking out any package videos or VTRs, we were 20 minutes into the show, and it's Paul Heyman and Jimmy Uso in the back having a chit-chat. Well, I'm trying to get my bearings straight because I want to make sure that even I understood what was going on here. I mean, the Bloodline story has been kind of a hot mess for a while. They're trying to revamp some things, trying to take it in a new direction. They've now split Jey Uso away from the group, and now he's on Raw. Jimmy's trying to get on Roman's good side again, because he did fuck Jey out of the title at SummerSlam back in August. The last time we saw Jimmy, I believe he was getting punked out by John Cena in a total throwaway segment. Now, a week later, I'm supposed to buy that he's a badass when he jumps AJ Styles and hurls him over some equipment cases. Pfft. Color me skeptical. Really, though, that's basically the extent of what happened here. Paulie told Jimmy that Roman and Solo aren't here. They're not entirely sure that Jimmy's back with the Bloodline again, because Roman hasn't greenlit anything yet. So after Jimmy leaves, AJ confronts Paul and grabs him by the lapel, and then Jimmy blindsides him and chucks him over a bunch of cases. And he looked at Paul and went, yeet. That was it. They're trying something. I don't know what the hell it is or where it's going, but it's something. If the end game is AJ Styles versus Roman Reigns, all right. Would not have been my first choice for Roman's next opponent, but they certainly could do worse. He's absolutely not as red hot as LA Knight is right now. I can tell you that much. Holy mother of God, this dude is fucking over. I know that's a news-breaking bulletin here in the year 2023. So here comes Knight for a promo, because, well, he's got to talk to us. Yeah.
Yeah! Yeah!
And, well, he mentioned something about The Miz. Apparently there was a Raw segment that happened a few days ago, and Miz was involved. Still taking pot shots at LA Knight. Not sure exactly what happened there, but sounds like despite the fact that Knight got the clean win over Miz at Payback, typical WWE fashion, this feud must continue. Which I really had no curiosity in seeing, but, I mean, it is probably the most interesting thing The Miz has done, and it's the most interesting thing The Miz has ever done. I did like LA Knight addressing the fact that even though John Cena gave him the endorsement and counted the 3 at the pay-per-view, doesn't mean that LA Knight necessarily needed it. He gave himself the stamp of approval because look around. LA Knight's the most over guy in the company right now. He's on top of the world. With or without Cena's help, he had nothing to do with it. And right as he's about to accept the Miz's challenge for a rematch, out comes Grayson Fodder. And the segment completely hit a brick wall for about the next 3 minutes. He's trying to be a personality, but between the thick accent, the goofy look, the fucking douchey high school haircut, is it unfair to say this guy looks like a miscast H&M model? I repeat everything I've ever commented about the whole Grayson Waller gimmick. Look, I know he's one of Sean's boys. Hunter probably likes him because he's good friends with Sean. Doesn't want to hurt his feelings. But seriously, Braun fucking Breaker is still meandering about in developmental, but this fucking Grayson clown is all over this goddamn show right now. In key segments. They're plugging him in with their hottest babyface on either show right now. It's Death TV. So thank God Austin Theory came out, because he's far and away superior to Grayson as an effective heel. At least he looks like a pro wrestler of some description. In any case, they're all out there jaw-jacking for a little bit. It was wait for them to pitch to break so they could come back to do the Theory versus Knight match. I just laughed hearing LA Knight use terms such as mush-mouth moron, cross-eyed half-wit, and my personal favorite, crotch goblins. Yeah, he actually said that. This is like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson level of terrible insults. To where only a guy like The Rock could ever get it over without looking like a complete buffoon. No other human being alive could get away with referring to somebody as a crotch goblin and make it work. Unless your name is LA Knight. And there's only one of him. So we come back for the match. LA Knight is now officially full-blown babyface. No more shades of gray. And this match would have been a million times better if somebody came out with a cane and yanked Grayson Fodder off the headset. Who the fuck allowed him on the commentary desk? Whoever greenlit that should have been immediately fired. To be honest with you, though, for a match featuring LA Knight and Austin Theory, it wasn't as noteworthy as you might expect. They wrestle for about 2 minutes. They go to break with Theory planting Knight with an apron neck breaker. They come back. Theory gets about another minute or two of heat. Knight makes the comeback. Theory cuts him off with a suplex on the floor. Grayson unhooks the turnbuckle pad for a spot that did not factor into the finish at all. And they did a few more things before Knight just hit Theory with the BFT and pinned him. I mean, at the end of the day, the best compliment I can give it is that they're giving Knight more frequent TV wins. It's a step in the right direction compared to what they were doing with him prior. You know, where he'd win a match and then lose the next 5 or 6 in a row. At least they're being consistent. And it's probably setting up some kind of tag match with Theory and Fodder against LA Knight and presumably John Cena, I guess. And they could always throw Ray in there because I know Theory was still technically doing the U.S. title thing at one point. I think the bigger attraction match is Theory and Fodder against Knight and Cena. Okay. I mean, as long as LA Knight gets the win, I'm fine with it. If Cena's ego doesn't get in the way and he just hangs out in the backdrop and lets LA Knight get the shine, cool. Kind of sucks how Theory is basically being used as a plot device to further advance the LA Knight push. But at least they're finally doing the right thing when it comes to capitalizing on Knight's popularity. How far they go with it, well, that's another conversation entirely. For now, though, this is good. So after that, we had a Finn Balor, Damian Priest versus Brawling Brutes tag match. Oh, actually, before that, I got a little ahead of myself here. I hate it when they do these stupid inset promos when they've already pitched to a ring introduction, but well, this one was at least worth talking about, so I made sure to take notes on it. So you got Paul Heyman and Adam Pearce talking in his office, and I wasn't exactly clear on what was going on here at first, but I think the idea is that Pearce is looking to draft somebody over from Raw, but he's not keeping Paulie in the loop because he's a dick. I have no idea. Doesn't matter, though. Because here comes LA Knight. Yeah. And he tells Pearce to make the match official for next week on SmackDown. He wants The Miz, which gets approved. And then we get this awesome face-off between him and Paul Heyman. Paulie's just doing his thing, being a total slimy weasel, pretending to be all buddy-buddy with Knight, you know, propping him up on a pedestal before telling him at the very end, the next time somebody lets you into the room when Heyman's conducting business, you should at least give him the common courtesy of knocking first. And after he goes, "Are we clear?" Knight gets right in Heyman's ear and he goes, "Yeah." And of course, Heyman slithers off with his head down, realizing that he just picked a fight he couldn't deal with himself. That was at least really good foreshadowing, though. Because if that sets up something for later down the pike with LA Knight and the Bloodline, well, again, it's a whole other rabbit hole to dive into, but suffice it to say, provided we get a suitable outcome, I'm not going to say no to that. They need some top storylines right now, especially on SmackDown, so why not? But going back to the match at hand, I don't remember if I wrote this down or not. I think it was non-title. I also don't really have an explanation for how the Judgment Day can now just randomly jump ship to SmackDown. I mean, yeah, technically they are the undisputed tag champions. So are Sammy and KO for all those months. Where the hell were they at when they were walking around with the belts? How often did we see them on SmackDown post-WrestleMania? Twice. They also got to do a promo before their match. And I'll be honest, I didn't really pay all that close attention to the material. I just love the idea that despite the fact that all three guys are heels and the fans are supposed to hate all of them collectively, they'll never let Dirty Dom get a word in edgewise. But like as soon as Damian and Finn go back to doing their promo, the fans are kind enough to let them at least say their piece. You know, even if they end up booing them, they are still kind enough to let them actually do their fucking promo. Not Dom. They drown that kid out. And, you know, like, okay, here it was totally obvious. Yes, they were turning up the canned heat. to a ridiculous degree. Like, they were pumping in boos so audibly here. If they cranked the volume up to 120, I wouldn't be shocked at all. Like, we've definitely established that when Dom is on the microphone, the fans are ruthless with booing him out of the building. Like, it's just basically part of the gimmick now. I mean, he is the most over-wart shoot heel in the company. It is fantastic. But, like, the way they were going out of their way to just pipe in all the artificial crowd noise, like, it was just ridiculous here. But it was funny, I will admit. Unfortunately, the crowd heckling of Dom was highly more interesting than the actual match. And this got some time, too. What did they give it, like 13 minutes from bell to bell? I mean, it was okay. I liked the match. Everyone worked hard. A lot of it was back and forth between both teams. And the biggest pop out of everything they got in the match was Butch grabbing Dom by the hair and giving him the clubbing blows to the chest. They didn't give a shit about anything else that happened prior. Guys are out there landing on their necks or doing corkscrew dives out to the floor. When Dom was in prone position to get his chest caved in, everybody leapt to their feet. One thing I did note here, it was very odd seeing Priest hit Butch with what was essentially the same BFT move that Knight hit earlier to win his match. Here, though, it was just a random near fall. And they just glossed right over the move like it was nothing. Never even drew attention to it. But they go back and forth at the end. Priest gave Butch a South of Heaven chokeslam onto Ridge. And then Balor hit Ridge with the coup de grace for the 3. Again, fine match. Good action. I don't really know if the Judgment Day are going to be a regular stable on SmackDown going forward, but if it means I get to hear and see more of Dom Mysterio, then sure. I'm all in on that. I'm not sure if I'm excited about the idea of seeing them feud with the Street Profits and Bobby Lashley. Mostly in the sense that I'm yet to figure out what exactly this stable is supposed to be. Or why they're meant to be seen as babyfaces when they're out there rocking the spiffy suits. They got the total heel look going on. The shades. The stern, stone-cold attitudes. I don't know. I mean, I really didn't know what was going on with this group beforehand. But they seem very miscast if they're going to be good guys. I think at some point down the road it would be nice to actually see them get a team name. Instead of Lashley just referring to them as us. Because that's basically what he said in his promo. It's not the Judgment Day that's going to be taking over. It's us. Okay. And who is us? Apparently the team of Bobby Lashley and his 2 sidekicks. Oh, we'll see where it goes. Maybe it'll grow on me. Like mold to drywall. But that basically took us to the TV main event. Why don't you gloss over a few more plugs for next week's program? Plus a random Asuka pre-tape where she ranted in Japanese for another minute. It's Jimmy Uso versus AJ Styles. The so-called proving ground match for Cousin Jimmy. And, well, yeah. Remember that thing they were running with? Referring to Jey Uso as main event Jey Uso? After watching this match, I take back everything I ever said about that moniker not getting over with me. I will take main event Jey Uso any day of the week over mediocre mid-card Jimmy Uso. This had to be the most boring match of all time. Am I wrong? They wrestled for like 3 or 4 minutes before the commercial. Literally nothing of substance happened. Right before the break, Solo and Heyman came out to scout in the aisleway. Jimmy was already in control offensively, so it wasn't even a distraction spot. Of course, the first thing I thought immediately, didn't Paul say that Solo wasn't at the building earlier on? So why the hell was he out there for this match? I guess the simple, lazy answer is Paul lied. Which I would totally buy because it's Paul Heyman, but still. So they come back. Jimmy and AJ are trading some stuff. I'm about as bored watching this as Solo looked being stone-faced on the floor. He was probably thinking the same thing I was. God, this match is so dull. And here's what they came up with for their finish. Very creative. Solo and Jimmy have a face-off outside the ring. AJ posts Jimmy. He throws him back in the ring. Phenomenal forearm. 1, 2, 3. And with about a minute left of airtime, Solo hits the ring and AJ bolts. And while AJ had his back turned, here come Damian Priest and Finn Balor to jump AJ from behind. They throw AJ back in the ring so Solo can finish the job. And then he delivers the spike to AJ while he and the Judgment Day have a little face-off. At which point I deem this the beginning of the Cahoots storyline. Because that's basically what we're looking at, right? The Judgment Day and the Bloodline working as a cohesive unit. Good Lord. How long before it turns into the next corporate ministry storyline, where they get half the goddamn heel roster on board with this giant clusterfuck? I mean, it'll probably be a little better thought out than that, if I'm being serious. It's kind of hard to tell what it's leading to, but you know what? I'll give him this. I like the idea, if for no other reason, with Priest still technically being the Money in the Bank holder, it does put him in like a prime position to maybe do a cash-in on Roman if they wanted to keep things fresh. Maybe an interesting plot twist in the works. Like, that's at least something that could whet my appetite. As far as them doing a full-blown Judgment Day Bloodline Bond or supergroup, I mean, okay. I don't really know what the end game is. Like I said, unless it's a way for the Judgment Day to lull the Bloodline into a false sense of security so Priest can find some tricky way to cash in Money in the Bank. Whether or not he does that successfully, I mean, that's yet to be seen, but the idea is there on the table. So I find that interesting. Does it come off as them grasping at straws for ideas? Oh, absolutely. I've said for a while that the Bloodline story is very stale. And ever since the SummerSlam fallout, it really seemed like they didn't have much of a game plan for where they wanted to take all the Jey Uso stuff. I don't know, the Judgment Day affiliation kind of seems like a last-minute call. But I'm not going to rule it out. I haven't been the biggest fan of the Judgment Day stuff for a while, but maybe they can suck me back in. Maybe. The Jimmy Uso singles push is still kind of hard for me to buy. But again, they need to try something to keep the Bloodline relevant. So, all right. Even if it's an interim thing or temporary storyline, let's see where the Judgment Day Alliance goes. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. But there you have it. That was your Monday edition of the FSWR podcast. As always, make sure you always subscribe, comment, like the show. Jump on board with the FSWR train every Monday and Friday. And we will be back this Friday for, well, I guess you could call it the season launch of the Classic Review Series only. Take out Dynamite, and now we're going to mainly focuses on the territorial footage for the Friday show. So we got NWA Crockett, we got Mid-South, and we got World Class on the horizon. I'm definitely looking forward to it. It'll be less draining of my energy. With that said, we'll catch you guys on the flip side. Thanks for watching, and take care. Peace out.